Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. This morning we'll continue where we left off yesterday in the book, The History of Romanism by John Dowling. Yesterday we concluded by a brief discussion as it is, but a discussion about how the papacy used the opportunity of the Crusades to advance itself in financial wealth. The papacy used the Crusades as a cash cow. Remember, it was the Pope who set the Crusades in motion, Urban II. And virtually Europe was abandoned. Every able-bodied man, woman, and child who wished to go on this crusade to have their sins expiated by liberating Jerusalem from the Turks left all their property to the papacy, to the church. And the papacy used that opportunity to increase its wealth in terms that are incalculable. Okay, people knew that they were going to die in this crusade. And so before they left on their crusades, they made out their wills. And they left their property in the hands of the priests and the popes of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, no one can put a dollar value on the financial increases of the Roman Catholic Church at the time of these crusades. But let's leave the financial gains for a minute and talk about the power of the Pope. At this time, at the turn of the millennium, one single man, was the commander of a multinational, that is a European war effort. He was the commander-in-chief of a multinational coalition to go down to Jerusalem and liberate Jerusalem from the Turks. It was a religious war conducted by the man of sin, the papacy. We need to kind of wrap our brains around how much power the papacy exerted. And put yourself in the place of one of the kings of Europe at this time. You have a responsibility to see that the economy is running and production is up and people are fed, but the country over which you are ruling is being depleted by millions of people leaving the country. Now, if you're a king of one of these coalition countries and your armies have been commanded to leave and to go to the so-called Holy Land, what are you going to use to defend your country? How's your economy going to run? Who's going to till the farms? Who's going to till the ground and produce food for the people? The countries were left in shambles, and the authority of the kings had no weight against the authority of the Pope. Everyone just suspended their lives and went on this crusade and left their countries to fend for themselves. The old, the lame, the halt, those who couldn't take care of themselves were left behind, as well as children. Were the countries run by children and old men? Okay, let me ask you another question. Now that we've talked at least a little bit about the power exerted by the papacy in this crusade, what about those literate, Bible-believing Christians who, since the very first century, knew for a fact who the Antichrist was? That it was the papacy. What do you think they had to say about these crusades? what do you think they had to say about the Pope, the man of sin, the son of perdition? That's what they believed. Now that all of Europe is obeying the Pope's commands, and the Pope has now commissioned a multinational crusade, a European crusade, overturned the economies of all nations, and conscripted vast human resources to go down to Jerusalem, leaving the countries where they resided, and all the land and all the properties in the hands of the popes and the bishops, the Pope's men. What do you think Bible-believing Christians were saying of the whole thing? And what do you think were the outcomes of those sayings? A Bible-believing Christian had to be convicted by the Holy Spirit to identify the papacy as the Antichrist and to set an example for all of those who were deceived by him in not conscripting themselves to go down to this crusade. They stayed home. Able-bodied men and women stayed home. They wouldn't put the cross on their forehead or on their chest. They wouldn't put the cross on their shoulders. They spoke out against this Inquisition and against the man of sin who commissioned it. What do you think happened to them? They were persecuted. They were counted as traitors. They were counted as non-Christians. Now, the author doesn't address this, but common sense dictates that if any able-bodied man or woman, a Bible-believing Christian, who knew who the man of sin, the son of perdition was, that it was the papacy, and that this crusade was nothing but the wars, and rumors of wars spoken of in the Scriptures, and protested against it, as was their spiritual command from the Lord on high, to fight against Antichrist, they were persecuted. That's the end of, that's the life and times of the saints throughout history. Persecuted every time they stood up against the man of sin, and identified and made people aware of his deceptions. Now, people were ready to give up their lives, give up their properties, give up their families, their children, their possessions, will all their possessions to the church, and go down in a crusade knowing that they were going to lose their life. They were committed. And a Bible-believing Christian who was telling the truth about the whole thing was making folly of the whole thing. You must know that they were hated. Above all flesh, they were hated more than anyone. That's the life of a Bible-believing Christian. No friends. No one to agree with you. You've got to stand on your own 2 feet. You've got to stand on the Scriptures. You've got to stand on Christ and take what comes. And they took it. And their blood is still crying from the ground for justice. The earth is soaked with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. And why is the earth soaked with their blood? Because they protested the Pope and all of his crusades and all of his Roman Catholic canon law and all of his filthy lucre, all of his idolatry, all of his simony, all of his sodomy, all of his doctrines of demons, and for deluding the masses and leading them away from Christ. They paid with their lives to tell the truth. They were bold to tell the truth, and they suffered. That's just a little more background than what the author gives us. But you have to comprehend what effect the Crusades had in Europe at this time. Now we're going to continue with subsection 26. This is on page 265. He says another effect of the expeditions to the Holy Land, that is the Crusades, was the introduction of vast quantities of old bones of saints and other reputed relics, You can remember yesterday I had trouble coming up with that word, relics. Don't we all have a brain fade from occasion? And after you've exceeded the year 60, these brain fades come a little bit more frequently. But there's the word, relics. The Roman Catholic Church collects bones and articles of clothing, bits of hair, fingernails, whatever they can get of a dead saint, and they worship it. It's idolatry. It's one of the defining characteristics of Antichrist. The Roman Catholic Church has spent vast sums of money buying and acquiring these so-called relics. And they're held in positions of veneration in monasteries around the world. People come and pray to these bits of bone and hair and teeth, and it's just diabolical. And they even preserve the bodies of their popes for public display, and people kneel and pray at these mausoleums with dead popes mummified in full view of the public. And it's one of the identifying characteristics of the Antichrist Church of Rome. Now it says the inhabitants of the country were aware of the passion of the Crusaders for these articles, these relics, and strove to make the gullibility of Christians as large a source of profit as possible to themselves. Okay? So even the Greeks and the Syrians were going to cash in. All these gullible, idolatrous Roman Catholics from Europe are coming down to this crusade, and they dug up bones wherever they could find them to sell to Roman Catholics. It says, upon their return to Palestine, after the taking of Jerusalem, they brought with them a vast number of pretended relics, which they bought at a high price from the cunning Greeks and Syrians, and which they considered as the noblest spoils that could crown their return from the Holy Land. Okay? So if they managed to make it back to Europe after the crusade to the Holy Land, what they valued more than anything of the spoils were these relics. Old, dry bones. And it says, these they committed to the custody of the clergy in the churches and the monasteries. Okay? So they gave their bones, their prizes of war, their spoils of war, to the churches. You know, remember before they left, they gave all their land and all their property to the church. And when they came back, if they managed to survive, they carried with them the bones of pretended saints, and they gave those to the church. Can you comprehend how much power the Roman Catholic Church has at this time? He says, these they committed to the custody of the clergy in the churches and the monasteries, or ordered them to be most carefully preserved in their families from generation to generation. Okay? Roman Catholicism teaches that if you are in possession of a holy relic, you have preservation from on high. Okay? You have protection. Can anybody find any example of this in the Scriptures? No. This is paganism. Okay? I remember when I was a little kid, everyone drove around and the keys of their car stuck in the ignition, and on the keychain was a rabbit's foot. They called it a lucky rabbit's foot. Is anybody old enough to remember the lucky rabbit's foot? What is that? Or is there luck or providence or hope in the dead bones of animals? Well, listen, if you believe that there is protection or anything of efficacy in the dead bones of a rabbit, much more would you venerate the dead bones of a saint, right? The lucky rabbit's foot was just a way to introduce relic worship into the Protestant world. I can remember my dad and even my uncles when I was a little kid driving around in the car some sunny Sunday afternoon And there, hanging from the ignition key in the car, was a lucky rabbit's foot. What is that, Daddy? Oh, that's a lucky rabbit's foot. Seemed rather harmless at the time, but now I know the motive behind it. If you think there's anything at all to be availed by having on your person or in your possession the bones of a dead rabbit, well, then you're just a hop, skip, and a jump from being a full-blown necromancy idolater of the Roman Catholic Church. Okay? You can just consider it one of the tenets of the ecumenical movement. Okay? Same thing, the Bible forbids idolatry, the bowing down and worshiping of images and idols. Okay? Any Christian can tell you, any Bible-believing Christian can tell you it's an abomination before the Lord to see one of his children kneeling down to an inanimate object. An object that is so inferior to the God of glory that created all heaven and earth and man and the sea and everything that in them is. To bow down and worship an image and idol is disgusting. Okay? To pray to inanimate objects, statues, paintings. Every Roman Catholic does it. So how did the Roman Catholic Church get this introduced into the Protestant world? When you were a little girl or a little boy, did you play with a doll? That's right, an inanimate object. A doll. Dressed it up in clothes, pretended conversations with it, carried it to bed with you, brought it out with you in the morning when you went up for breakfast. Seemed rather harmless at the time, didn't it? Everybody just kind of snickered. But if you will care so much for an inanimate object, maybe that would make you fit to be a Roman Catholic, wouldn't it? Do you think I'm stretching it? There's no more subtle influence in the world than Satan. And I maintain that idol worship and necromancy and the worship of relics and holy bones is instituted in the United States from the cradle. We don't dare to call it Roman Catholicism because that would offend the little children and would offend the parents that bought the little dolly or the little lucky rabbit's foot. But that's the truth. Okay? We're to pray to a living, breathing, walking, talking God in heaven. No, we can't see him, because if we were to look upon his glory, we would go up like smoke. So we're not allowed to see him. But all we have to do is look at his creation. We know he's alive. Do you know how much it offends God to teach little children to converse with inanimate objects? To make them fit for the man of sin and idol worship and relic worship? It's instituted in our society from the cradle to the grave. And few are brave enough to admit the influence of Roman Catholicism even over our little children. We've been duped. It's no longer an innocent thing. It's no longer something to be snickered at. Okay? Get the dollies out of the house. Teach the children to pray to the living God. Have a relationship with the Creator. That's true biblical Christianity. Now, all these idol worshippers coming back from the Holy Land, the so-called Holy Land, being victorious over the Turks, what did they relish of all their possessions, all the spoils of war, more than anything? Relics. Lucky rabbit's foots. Okay? He said, among others of these pretended relics, Matthew Paris relates that the Dominican friars brought a white stone in which they asserted that Jesus Christ had left the impression of his feet. Okay? Here we have a monastic order of the Roman Catholic Church, the Dominican Friars, and they brought home from the Crusades a white stone, which they said had the impression of Jesus' feet in it. Okay? You know how precious that must be to the Roman Catholic Church? A white stone with Jesus' feet imprinted in it? He said a handkerchief said to have been Christ's is worshipped at Byzantium, which was brought by the Crusaders from the Holy Land, and the Genoese pretend to have received from Baldwin, the second king of Jerusalem, the very dish in which the paschal lamb was served up to Christ and his disciples at the Last Supper, though this famous dish excites the laughter of even Father Labat in his travels in Spain and Italy. Okay? So even Roman Catholics, some Roman Catholics, laugh at the absurdity of these claims, much as we should laugh at the absurdity of a lucky rabbit's foot. Okay? Now, he continues, he says, the Greeks and Syrians, whose avarice and fraud were excessive, imposed upon the credulity of the simple, that is, the stupid and ignorant Latins, and often sold them fictitious relics of at enormous prices. Okay, we've read examples of. They've done forensic tests on some of these bones that they brought back from the Crusades that are still extant. They still exist. They're still venerated in the Roman Catholic Church. They're still put under glass, lighted candles all the way around them, a kneeler placed in front of the altar there where they can kneel and pray without bruising their knees. They've proven to be the bones of cats and dogs and sheep and oxen and goats. Okay? No saint, a dead animal. Just like a lucky rabbit's foot, which is no different than the bones of a dead saint. There's no power in the bones of a dead saint. That's the difference between true biblical Christianity and Roman Catholicism. He said the sacred treasures of musty bones and rags which the French, the German, and other European nations preserved formerly with so much care and show, quote, even in our times with such pious ostentation, says the historian Mosheim, are certainly not more ancient than those holy wars. In other words, the bones that they brought back were not ancient holy saints. They were from victims who died in the war. He says they are certainly not more ancient than these holy wars, but were then purchased at a high rate from these cunning traders in superstition, unquote. The cunning traders of superstition. He says there are other incidents in the life of Pope Urban which are worthy of relation, as exhibiting the pomp and the pride of the popes in this age of the world, but as they are chiefly connected with the history of popery in England, and relation to them will be deferred to the next chapter, which is devoted to the department of our discussion. We'll talk about England when we get back from the break.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host, Melody Cedarstrom, right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, 1-800-375-4188.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. And if you'd like to support Inquisition Update and keep this program on the air, please support First Amendment Radio. Now, Chapter 4. Popery in England after the Conquest, Archbishop Anselm and Thomas A. Becket. We're going to talk about the history of England now. But before we begin, I want to remind the listeners what we've learned heretofore in the book, that England brought the gospel either by the Apostle Paul or those Bible-believing Christians who sat under his ministry shortly thereafter. The gospel found root in England. Yes, it was a pagan nation before the gospel entered England, but once the gospel reached England, the people believed. They believed in the grace, the mercy, and the gift of salvation that we have in Christ Jesus. Salvation by grace through faith and not of works. And so England, for the Pope, was a tough nut to crack. Okay? The papacy wielded his authority over all the other kings of the earth, but he had a tough time in England. Which naturally you would expect that anyone who has absorbed the gospel and really understood the meaning of the gospel, that you are saved by grace through faith and not of works, lest any man should boast, they weren't anxious to allow the papacy to usurp its authority of the gospel and to spread a works salvation. So England, different than all the other nations of Europe, didn't produce many crusaders. And the Pope had to conquer England. If the gospel could go forward to England, it might convert all of Europe. It was essential that the papacy get control of England and strip it of the gospel and replace it with Roman Catholicism, Pope worship, idol worship, so that the Pope might add England to its crusades. Okay? They must destroy the gospel wherever it exists. And so the papacy has made a centuries-long effort at finally conquering England and silencing the gospel of grace. Now, this is subsection 27 of the book. We're on page 266 if you're following along. It says, the successors of Hildebrand, Pope Gregory VII, remember, the successors of Hildebrand, as we have seen, were by no means slow to copy the example left by him of tyrannizing over the sovereigns and the governments of the earth. As several of the most remarkable instances of papal assumption during the 11th and 2 centuries following, that's the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, occurred in Great Britain, we shall again invite the attention of the reader for a chapter or two to the history of the affairs of that island. About the middle of the 11th century, a most important revolution occurred in the government of England. William, Duke of Normandy, afterwards surnamed the Conqueror, William the Conqueror, had long looked with a greedy eye upon England. Before undertaking its conquest, however, William the Conqueror thought it prudent to secure the powerful alliance of the Pope, who, says the historian Hume in his History of England, quote, had a mighty influence over the ancient barons, no less devout in their religious principles than valorous in their military enterprises. It was a sufficient motive to Alexander II, the reigning pope at the time, for embracing William's quarrel, that he alone had made an appeal to his tribunal, but there were other advantages which that pontiff foresaw must result from the conquest of England by the Normans. So, William the Conqueror sought the blessing of the Pope before he launched his invasion of England. And the Pope, seeing another opportunity to gain power and strength, and to expand his dominions, and to destroy the gospel in England, and to replace it with Roman Catholicism, took sides with William the Conqueror. They're going to overthrow the government of England. They're going to conquer England. They're going to make it Roman Catholic. Now, he says that kingdom maintained still a considerable independence in its ecclesiastical administration, and forming a world within itself entirely separated from the rest of Europe. It had hitherto proved inaccessible to those exorbitant claims which supported the grandeur of the papacy. Okay? So here you have evidence that the gospel had sunk to the marrow of the bones of the English people. Christ was their king. He was their redeemer. He was their confessor. He was their intercessor. They had no need for a pope. Okay? The Pope and Christ are as different as night and day. One is the antithesis of the other. England was not going to anxiously accept the papal authority. They had their king, they had their constitution, the Bible, and they were going to worship Christ and Him only. They weren't going to answer to the Pope. All right? That kingdom, England, maintained still a considerable independence in its ecclesiastical administration, and forming a world within itself entirely separated from the rest of Europe, it had hitherto proved inaccessible to those exorbitant claims which supported the grandeur of the papacy. In other words, they rejected the papacy. And anybody who receives Christ truly always rejects the papacy. The papacy is the man of sin, the son of perdition. You can't serve two masters. Okay? So England is a tough nut to crack for the Pope, because the gospel sank deep to the marrow of the bones of the English people. So the Pope's got to use force to overthrow England. And William the Conqueror is the man. It says, Alexander therefore hoped that the French and Norman barons, if successful in their enterprise, might import into that country a more devoted reverence for the Holy See. He therefore declared immediately in favor of William's claim, pronounced the legitimate king, Harold, a perjured usurper, denounced excommunication against him and his adherents, and the more to encourage the Duke of Normandy in his enterprise, sent him a consecrated banner, a flag consecrated by the Pope. The Pope waved his magic hands in a figure of the cross over this banner. That's what made it holy. That's what made it consecrated. And he also sent him a ring, quote, with one of St. Peter's hairs in it, unquote. So, William the Conqueror's just received gifts from heaven, right? God's on his side. The Pope's on his side. He's going to conquer Great Britain. He's going to conquer England. And the Pope, in order to justify this, just simply announces to the world that the present king in England, Harold, is a perjured usurper, and he denounced excommunications against him, kicked him out of heaven, right? Made him a heretic. Just by the words of his mouth. Took the legitimate king of England and just, he's no longer king. That's the power that the Pope wields. You know, you've heard the term the kingmaker. There's no greater kingmaker in all the history of the world than the papacy. He makes and breaks kings and kingdoms. And the Bible forecasts that he will. All right? We look in the future for an Antichrist when the papacy has fulfilled every prophecy in the Bible regarding the man of sin. And so the Pope gets an opportunity to overthrow the gospel. That's the real enemy of the papacy, to overthrow the gospel in England. So he denounces the legitimate King Harold as a usurper, and he excommunicates him and puts his blessing upon William the Conqueror by sending him a consecrated flag and a ring with one of the hairs of St. Peter in it. All right, subsection 28, page 266, it says, upon the accession of Gregory VII, that imperious pontiff wrote to King William, that's William the Conqueror, requiring him to fulfill his promise of doing homage to the kingdom of England to the See of Rome. Okay? William is instructed that he must fulfill his promise to obtain the homage of England to the See of Rome, and he sent him over that tribute which his predecessors had been acquainted to pay to the Vicar of Christ, meaning Peter's pence, a charitable donation of the Saxon princes, which the court of Rome construed into a badge of subjection acknowledged by the kingdom. Okay? Now, we related a story earlier where one of the kings of England, one of the early kings of England, would not, he was formerly a Saxon who had converted to Christ, and when the Pope demanded that they pay taxes to the Holy See, to the papacy, he agreed to pay taxes, but he would not bend the knee to the Pope. Okay? So there was set a precedent that England must pay what is known as Peter's pence. That's a tax to the Pope. All right? The Pope, by some spiritual power of some kind, which he doesn't truly possess, laid the conviction upon the government of England that it must pay a tax to the Roman pontiff. They conceded to that, and that is the door into which the Pope immediately sticks his foot and won't let it close. Okay? Because England ever acknowledged any power of the papacy and agreed to pay taxes to the papacy, Rome sees that as an admission that England is ready to succeed or secede to the power of the Pope. If the Pope has the power to tax, the Pope has the power to rule the country. All right? This is the foundation. It says, upon the accession of Gregory VII, that imperious pontiff wrote to King William, requiring him to fulfill his promise of doing homage for the kingdom of England to the See of Rome, and to send him over that tribute, that tax, which his predecessors had been accustomed to pay to the Vicar of Christ, meaning Peter's pence, a charitable donation of the Saxon princes, which the court of Rome construed into a badge of a badge of subjection acknowledged by the kingdom. Okay? They paid Peter's pence, and that is construed by Rome to be a badge of subjection. If you pay Peter's pence, you've set precedent that you are now a vassal of the Roman See. That's how the Pope gets his powerful foot in the door. If he can guilt trip a nation into paying it taxes, then the door's wide open for papal influence, papal control. This is the justification where the papacy has agreed to support William the Conqueror in his conquest of England. England has already been paying Peter's pence, and the king will not bend the knee to the Pope. He'll pay the tax, but he won't bend his knee to the Pope. So, now that the door is open, the Pope has his justification for empowering William the Conqueror to take England and make it Roman Catholic, to continue to pay Peter's pence, and then to expect the king, William the Conqueror, to bend the knee to the Pope. Now, William coolly replied that the money should be remitted as formerly, but that he neither had promised to do homage to Rome, nor entertained any thoughts of imposing that servitude on his kingdom. Nay, he went so far as to refuse the England bishops liberty to attend a general council, which Gregory had summoned against his enemies. That's right, King William wouldn't even allow the bishops of the Roman Church in England to attend a general council called by the Pope. Okay? So he was in control of the bishops, not the Pope. Now, you know the Pope's not going to tolerate this very long. He said the following anecdote shows, in a still stronger light, the contempt of this prince for ecclesiastical dominion. Odo, bishop of Bayeux, the king's maternal brother, whom he had created Earl of Kent and entrusted with a great share of power, had amassed immense riches. And agreeable to the usual progress of human wishes, he began to regard his present eminence as only a step to future grandeur. Okay, so he's an ambitious man, right? He aspired at nothing less than the papacy, and had resolved to transmit all his wealth to Italy and go thither in person, accompanied by several noblemen who he had persuaded to follow his example in hopes of establishments under the future pope. Okay, so he's going to make himself a pope eventually. That's what he intends to do. So he's a papist. Guess what the Pope's going to do? He's going to use this man against his brother, William. Now, William, from whom this object had been carefully concealed, was no sooner informed of it than he accused Odo of treason and ordered him to be arrested. But nobody would lay hands on the bishop. Nobody would lay hands on Odo. He's the bishop of the Pope. Okay? You see the power struggle here? King William trying to maintain control over his own kingdom, and not have it fall into the hands of the Pope, finds his greatest opposition is his own brother, who has power that he has received, power and wealth that he has received from the Pope. And so William, in order to preserve his own power and sovereignty in England, orders his brother to be arrested for treason. Okay? This is an attempt to overthrow the king and to get power for the Pope, to conquer England. He said the king himself was therefore obliged to seize him, since nobody else would arrest him. William himself arrested him, and when Odo insisted that as a prelate, that is a prelate of the Roman Catholic Church, he was exempt from all temporal jurisdiction. Remember, that's Roman Catholic canon law. The civil power has no power over the priests of Rome. The priests of Rome answer to the Pope and to the Pope only. That's the way it is in England at the turn of the millennium, and that's the way it is in the United States and all over the world. The Pope picks his priests and his prelates and his bishops and his cardinals and his archbishops and the whole lot, and they serve the Pope independently of the government. Okay? Now, William finds that his brother is treasonous. He's obeying the Pope when William's plainly saying, I'll not bend the knee to the Pope, nor will I make this country servitude to the Pope. So Odo is planning to become Pope himself. So William's in a desperate situation. Now he arrests Odo, puts him in prison, or tries to, and Odo insists that he answers to the Pope and the Pope only. The temporal jurisdiction, that is the Kingdom of England, William the Conqueror has no power whatsoever over Odo. He has no authority to jail him. Now William boldly replied, quote, I arrest not the bishop, I arrest the earl, unquote. Do you understand what he's saying here? He says, I'm going to arrest you, but I'm arresting you as an earl and not as a bishop. You occupy two offices, one gifted to you from the Pope, and the other, the earl, gifted to you by me. And so I'm going to arrest you being a subject of me as earl. So, see, every prelate of the Roman Catholic Church serves two masters, right? The Pope on the one hand and the king on the other. And so William takes advantage of this duality and says, I'm not arresting you as a bishop, I'm arresting you as an earl, as a representative of the government. And so then he accordingly sent him prisoner to Normandy, where he was detained in custody during this whole reign, notwithstanding the remonstrances and menaces of Gregory. All right, this all has to do, if you've been following along, this has to do with investiture. This is the Roman Catholic canon law that says the Pope picks the religious bishops, cardinals, and all the officers of the church, and they answer to him and him only. And that the civil power, that is William in this case, has no power to appoint bishops or any of the officers of the church. This has to do with investiture. We've dealt with this before in the book. Now, the fact is that the haughty Pope found it a more difficult matter to break down the proud spirit of these sturdy Normans than of any other of the monarchs who he aimed to reduce to his sway. In the following reign, William Rufus, the son and successor of the Conqueror, upon the death of Lanfranc, Archbishop of Canterbury in 1089 A.D., refused for 5 years to appoint a successor and kept the temporalities of the archbishopric in his own hands. Okay, so He's going to act to keep the office of archbishop empty. Okay, look, if the papacy has made attempts to overthrow the government, and the king can maintain some control over the appointment of these bishops and archbishops, then he can limit the power of the pope within his realms, right? All right. During this interval, the bishops and the clergy tried various methods to prevail upon the king to appoint a primate in vain. He just simply wasn't going to appoint the archbishop. He says at one time when they presented a petition that he would give them leave to issue a form of prayer to be used in the churches of England, that God would move the heart of the king to choose an archbishop, he returned his careless answer, quote, "You may pray as you please, I will do as I please," unquote. So the king is not going to appoint a bishop. You know what this is all about? If he thought he had the power, he would evict all of the bishops of the Pope out of his realms. Right? England was paying an annual Peter's pence to the Pope. The Pope expected the king and all of the bishops to answer to the Pope. And at this point, there's no more England. It's just another papal fiefdom like the rest of Europe. Okay, this wise king sees the error in deferring in any degree to the papacy. And when this archbishopric becomes vacant, he doesn't appoint a new one. And so now the rest of the religious prelates in England, those under the influence of the Pope, are praying that he appoint an archbishop. Now he says, at length, in a fit of sickness, the king consented to the election of Anselm, who soon after requesting permission to go to Rome to receive his pall, that is a vestment, okay, the archbishop goes to Rome, Italy, to receive from the hand of the Pope the official signs and marks of his office. Okay, that consists of the pall, the P-A-L-L, which is a robe of the office of archbishop. Okay, he received his position from the king, but it's not really an archbishopric until he is vested by the Pope. So he has to go to Rome to receive the pall. See, here's the two masters, and we've run out of time. I hate the inappropriate ending here, but we'll continue with the reading on the program tomorrow. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. How Rome Conquered England will be the subject. I'll see you tomorrow.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn, the Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.